Black Women's Equal Pay Day is observed on July 27, and just a few days earlier, July 24, marks 14 years since the last time the federal minimum wage was raised. These 2 days are inextricably connected with the fact that Black women are overrepresented among low-wage workers. Even though we tend to talk about the pay gap in cents, it adds up to thousands and thousands of dollars in lost income each year for Black women. Black women working full-time, year-round, typically make 67 cents for every dollar earned by white, non-Hispanic men. And when looking at all Black women working, including part-time, they earn just 64 cents. These losses due to the wage gap can add up to nearly $1 million over the course of a career for Black women, with severe impacts on retirement and older age. This is a result of intersecting racial and gender bias in the workplace, manifesting through occupational segregation and low pay. All happening within the context of misogynoir, a term coined by feminist scholar Moya Bailey. Misogynoir is the interlocking of sexism and racism in the lives of Black women, undermining their ability to thrive. The consequences of this are a lack of economic security and economic opportunity. And since Black mothers tend to be the breadwinners of their families, this means American families struggling to make ends meet. And while Black women are resilient, they deserve better. How can we fix this? Progress on closing the pay gap has been far too slow, but Congress could take meaningful action to address this problem. When 42% of working Black women make below $17 an hour, could raising the minimum wage be an answer? Let's find out. I'm thrilled to introduce Jocelyn Fry, President of the National Partnership for Women and Families, and Rose Qatar, Director of Economic Analysis for Inclusive Economy at the Center for American Progress, to dive deeper into these issues and discuss the connection between raising the minimum wage and Black Women's Equal Pay Day.
Thanks so much, Edworth. Jocelyn, I'm excited to chat with you today about the minimum wage and Black Women's Equal Pay Day. So, July 24 marks 14 years since the last time the federal minimum wage was raised, extending by yet another year, the longest period in its history without an increase. So today the federal minimum wage is still just $7.25. And we know that women, and in particular Black women and Latinas, are overrepresented among the lowest wage earners. So talk us through what this period without an increase in the federal minimum wage has meant for women, and in particular for Black women.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rose, first of all, for having me here, and it's just great to chat with you. I think people should just think about what's happened since 2009. I mean, we've been through a great recession. We've been through, once we recovered from that, and then we have a pandemic. We've seen enormous volatility in the job market and in wages, and throughout that entire time, we haven't seen a budge in the minimum wage. There are more than 20 million workers who are working for minimum wage. That disproportionately affects women of color. If you look at, I think it's 40 states across the country, more than half of the women of color in those states, Black women, Latinas, Native women, are earning less than a living wage. And we also know that Black women and Latinas, in particular Latina moms and Black moms, are more likely than other mothers to be breadwinners in their families. So the fact that they are not earning a minimum wage, not earning fair wages, actually has a disproportionate economic effect on their family. So it's far past time for us to raise the minimum wage, but that's particularly important for Black women and Latinas who their families really look to for economic support.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. And so even though Congress has failed to take action over the last 14 years, we've seen many states and localities, step up to the occasion and raise their minimum wages. So we have about 30 states in DC who have a minimum wage higher than the federal minimum wage. And so opponents of raising the wage tend to talk about the economic harms that would happen from a higher minimum wage. But what would you say are the economic consequences of raising the minimum wage?
Well, I think we see those economic consequences. You have greater economic stability in families. You have greater consumer spending. They have more dollars in their pockets. You have a stronger economy because people can actually buy things. There's more consumer spending. So those families that rely on Black moms, Latina moms to make ends meet, if they have more dollars in their pocket, they can actually spend those dollars in ways that actually not only support their families, but support the the economy. It also helps to reduce their debt. We have lots of families that are struggling with, whether it's consumer debt, student loan debt, all of the above. And you want, at the end of the day, people to have the economic resources to be able to support themselves and their families, contribute to their communities. So I think we see time and time again, when you raise the wage, you not only help workers, but you're also helping employers retain those workers. Part of the dynamic with the pandemic of folks not wanting to go back to work to the extent that that was happening is because folks said, why am I going back to a job that is not going to pay me a living wage, that can't support my family? We have to rethink how we think the economy ought to be working, and it needs to work for people in a way that actually enables them to, support their families, support their communities. And, I think if we just push back on this mindset that we have to have a permanent group of people who are always poor, we actually can fundamentally change how the economy is really working for people.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's a choice that we're making to not raise the minimum wage, and it's detrimental to to economic growth as well. Yeah. So in a couple of days, July 27 marks Black Women's Equal Pay Day. And we know that Black women earn about 64 cents for every dollar earned by their white, non-Hispanic male counterparts. And for Black women working full-time year-round, they make about 67 cents. So what are some of the reasons behind the existence of the pay gap that Black women experience?
There are three things that drive the pay gap. One is where women work. Two is the fact that we have terrible care policies, and women, generally speaking, are far more likely to take time away from work to care for their families or to do all of the things that need to happen just to make sure that their family is functioning properly. And three, discrimination. And that's true for Black women. If you look at where they work, they disproportionately are working in lower paid jobs, what people refer to as occupational segregation. If you look at the top 10 jobs where Black women disproportionately work, those tend to be lower paying. They're home health aides, they're personal care aides, they're nursing assistants that tend to be lower paid in comparison to the jobs where white men are working. Their top 10 jobs are laborer jobs that, they tend to have just higher wages. If you compare those jobs and you look at the average wages, Black women are earning about $50,000 less than their white counterparts, just based on the top 10 jobs where they typically work. On top of that, you have Black women disproportionately in low-paid jobs, the service sector, public service sector, and so forth, that tend to be lower-paid jobs. And then we have workplaces that have consistently devalued Black women's work for decades, since they started working in the United States of America. And in that reality, they face not only sexism, but racism, but just perceptions that their work is less valuable. So when you combine that all together, you have persistent pay disparities. And that has been true whether you're looking at the jobs where they're more likely to work. If you look at jobs where they're doing the same job as somebody else, they're just making less than their white male counterpart or their white female counterpart. So you have to fix all those things, right? Like, you can't just fix one thing and make it go away. We have to have strategies that are really talking about how do you tackle discrimination? How do you make sure that folks, when they take time off from work, that they're not being overly penalized? And how do you actually make sure that the jobs where they're working are actually valued and paid better?
Yeah, and so when we talk about the pay gap, we talk about it in cents, but it isn't really a couple of cents lost, right? It's like adds up to thousands and thousands of dollars in lost income in a given year. And for Black women, it really snowballs over the course of their life to have detrimental impacts in older age and retirement. And so how do you think about the connection between the pay gap and the racial wealth gap and, the ability of Black women to accumulate wealth?
Right. Well, I think your question points us in exactly the right direction. When you add up the 67 cents or 64 cents and off the dollar, when you look over a 40-year career, Black women on average are losing a little under $1 million over their lifetime or their work lifetime, 40-year career, because of the pay gap. When you step back from that and recognize that in terms of economic stability, it's not just about your earnings. That's a piece of it. But when you think about how people build wealth, it's also about the assets that you're able to acquire. It's the financial investments that you're able to make over a lifetime and so forth. So if you're always sort of scrambling to make ends meet and never putting savings away, then you're going to have less to retire on. You're going to have less to live on in as you get older. And we see that with Black women historically. The wealth gap is enormous when you compare them to their white counterparts. And not only does that mean that they are having difficulty in terms of surviving over their lifetimes, but it also means that they have less to pass off to their children and their families and so forth. And when you understand what wealth looks like, earnings is only one component of it. It is your ability to have a house that you can hand off as an asset, and savings and other sorts of things. So the pay gap is one piece of a broader puzzle in terms of how do you make sure that people can not only be economically secure now, but really just going forward. And we have to be intentional about addressing both if we're really going to create economic stability for people over their lifetimes.
Yeah, and so when we think about how to address this, right, so one of the things that policymakers can do is raise the minimum wage, right? So CAP recently released an analysis that showed that if the minimum wage had been $15 in 2021, Black women's pay gap would have had its largest reduction on record. So it's very clear that the existence of the pay gap for Black women is a choice by policymakers. So what do you think are some meaningful steps policymakers could be taking to help close the pay gap?
Well, I think in addition to that, there are things like the Paycheck Fairness Act is a long-standing piece of legislation that would close some of the gaps in the law itself. It's hard to bring an equal pay case. It would make it harder for employers to use things like salary history as a mechanism to keep people stuck at a particular salary. It would deal with some of the long-standing issues that just make it harder for people to surface pay discrimination, to bring more transparency. So even just enabling folks to unearth discrimination is a way to push back. Things like pay data collection, just requiring employers to report their pay data, again, as an enforcement tool to hopefully push employers to think more concretely and look more concretely at their pay practices. So there are things like that that can be done. But there are also things that have to do with how do you make sure that women, in particular, when they go to work, if they need to take off time for caregiving, aren't being penalized. Things like paid leave, paid family leave, paid sick days, better child care, all of those care supports are really integral to the ability of women to be able to stay in the workforce uninterrupted, as opposed to having to leave their job because they have to care for their families. So there are things like that that can be helpful in terms of helping to close the gap. I think it is important for people to understand that all those things have to work in tandem, right? There's not a one-size-fits-all solution. The last thing I would say is it is really important to be intentional about the reality that Black women, Latinas often are encountering discrimination based on a number of factors, right? It's not just about gender, it's also about race, and also about, sort of assumptions about Black women workers that may be unique to them. So it's important for employers to look really closely at not simply what their pay gap is, but what's your pay gap for Black women? What's your pay gap for Latinas? And, I often say to people, if you're not solving the pay gap for Black women, then you're not solving the pay gap. Don't tell me that you've closed your gender gap, but yet you don't know whether or not Black women and Latinas and Native women in your workforce are being paid the same, right? You have to look that closely to really understand how this is playing out amongst your workers.
Yeah, and I think that point is really important because the context of a life of a Black woman is very different to other women, right? And so something I know that you've really emphasized is talking about how Black women work more than other women in the labor market, and Black mothers tend to be mothers that are most likely to be their family's breadwinner. So what would you say are the implications of the pay gap, not just on Black women but also their families?
Well, I think it is important for people to recognize that Black women often play a unique role in their families. If you look at mothers, generally speaking, Black mothers are the ones who are most likely to be the primary or sole breadwinners. More than 2/3 of Black mothers are primary or sole breadwinners in their families. If you look even more broadly at breadwinners, either co-breadwinners, so people who are maybe they're not the sole source of support, but they are an important source of support. More than 80% of Black mothers are, some form of breadwinner in their family. That's an enormous number of families, and that means that their pay is really critical to the stability of those families. It's not enough to just pay Black women a wage, right? If you're paying them a wage where they're going to earn, $50,000 less or $1 million less across a lifetime, that has an enormous effect on their families. And Black women, generally speaking, the families headed by Black women are a significant portion of Black families generally, right? So all of that is to say that Black women are really key to the economic stability of Black communities. And you have to make sure that they are being paid fairly. And if you create that ability to have some security in those families, stability in those families, you will then enable them to, as we said earlier, do the consumer spending, help the community thrive economically. Those things go hand in hand, but it starts with making sure that you're actually focusing on how do you make sure that Black women are paid what they deserve.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit to think about, the current state of play in the economy right now, and in particular for women. So we've seen since the COVID-19 recession, I would say a much more equitable economic recovery, particularly in the jobs market, than that of the past. So over the last year, we've seen Black women's unemployment rate hit a record low, employment rates for Latinas hit a record high. So what would you say are some of the lessons policymakers could take from their response to the COVID-19 recession? And do you see this progress in terms of women's employment? Is that a temporary progress? Do you see that there's opportunities for setbacks? How do we make that progress permanent as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think people have not paid enough attention to what happened during the pandemic, how we've made progress, and how do you actually sustain the progress. Because we have seen important gains for Black women and women generally speaking, where we've seen people come back, but you have to ask yourself, why did that happen? And so one reason it happened is because people were actually really intentional about making sure that folks were actually making decent wages, that they had the supports that they needed to make sure they had a caregiving obligation, that they were able to take that time. Boosting wages and giving people other sorts of supports helps them actually go to work, stay in work, and support their families. It's not rocket science, actually. And I think if we continue to invest in policies like that, we will do enormous things for not only Black women, but for women workers generally. And the Biden administration, I think, has been focused on what are the suite of interventions necessary to really improve women's employment and also help women workers stay in the workforce. However, we have to actually really be intentional about it, right? It's not just luck that it happened. And so it does require us to continuously think about boosting wages. It does mean that we need things like paid family and medical leave, and we need affordable childcare, and making sure that we actually have strong care policies. It does mean that we need to think about how do we value jobs and make sure that they're actually quality jobs and people are being paid wages that they're actually worth, as opposed to just relying on women, hopefully just make ends meet, right? How do we invest in particular in care jobs, care workers who were so essential during the pandemic? We can't forget that part of the story. And I think those investments in care workers in particular are important not only for women, but particularly for disproportionately women of color who are care workers. And I think that's sort of the unfinished business of the pandemic. We had some temporary interventions, but if we really are about the business of strengthening our economy over the long haul, then we actually have to invest in care in an intentional way. And that not only boosts the wages of women of color, but it also boosts the economic stability of those women and their families. So I think that's how we make progress. We have to normalize what happened during the pandemic, those investments, as essential to the future growth of our economy, and not think that simply a return to pre-COVID levels is what we're striving for. Because I think the thing that people need to focus on is, yes, we were able to do some things to quickly rebound, or rebound perhaps quicker than people anticipated, but we also had enormous failures because of what we didn't do before the pandemic, right? So our job is to make sure that we never have to go back to that again. And that means doing the investments that that have been so critical to the extent that there's been a recovery. But the last thing I would say is that we have made progress, but we haven't achieved success, right? Like, if you look at Black women, they continue, even with gains in employment and reduced unemployment, they continue to be higher than their white counterparts, right? Like, there is a, I think, assumption that Black women will always have worse outcomes, and that can't be an assumption that we allow to stand. So we also have to be digging at the same time into the question of how do we close these gaps, right? Like, the fact that Black women have lower unemployment is great, but the fact that it's twice the times as their white counterparts is not great, and we need to fix that.
Yeah, and I think that is really important, because even with the record lows, like you said, for Black women's unemployment, those unemployment rate levels for other groups would have been seen as crisis levels for other people. So it is really important to know that we've made gains and we know how to make gains, but those gains aren't good enough at this point. We need more. But it really underscores that we know how to make those gains. Policymakers can take meaningful action, and we have seen over the last few years policymakers step up in different realms, federal or state. We've seen pay transparency laws, we've seen salary history bans, we've seen paid leave. So I kind of want to end us on a more hopeful note. What actions have been taken over the last few years, either at the federal level or the state level, that give you a bit of hope that the future could be brighter for women and for Black women?
Well, I think, for me, what has given me hope over the last couple of years in particular are some of the things that you said. I mean, the reality is that during the pandemic, we did for a minute have a significant investment in mandatory paid leave. That mattered. We know it mattered. We had some enormous investments in childcare. It saved the childcare infrastructure and has been pivotal. We know that's been incredibly important. We know because of the pandemic that there have been efforts to boost some wages, particularly in jobs that women disproportionately hold, that there have been more intentional efforts around care infrastructure. Those have been critical. And it's not simply that those investments have made a difference for individual families. They have made it clear that those can't be the aberration, that if we are about the business of strengthening and growing our economy, that one piece of that puzzle has to be investing in care infrastructure as a part of that equation, that they go hand in hand. They're not either or. So that sort of change, and change in the narrative about what our economy should look like, how it needs to work in order to work not only for women workers, but particularly women of color workers. That's a change that I hope is one that will continue and we won't go back on. So that gives me a lot of hope, right? And I think the other thing I would say, I would be remiss in not saying, is that it all is happening at a moment where there has been just an incredible energy around worker empowerment and unionization, and workers speaking up and saying, this is what I need to actually not only survive in this workplace, but to support my family. So I think that gives me hope, right? Like the focus and intentional focus on what does it mean to create workplaces that really work for women, that work for Black women? What does that look like? That's not just a question for an employer, that's a question for a worker themselves, right? Like this is about creating work environments where people can feel good about the work that they're doing, that they can be successful, that they can work free of discrimination, that they can be paid fairly, that they can, feel good about the earnings and support their families. Those are the workplaces we should be creating. And I think there's a lot of energy and thought coming out of the pandemic about how you do that well, how you do that effectively, what do quality jobs look like, how do we actually create those for the future. That's what we need to be focused on if we're really about creating an economy that can work for everybody. And that gives me a lot of hope. There's a lot of energy in that. It's great to have this conversation, not simply about the minimum wage, but about how do you make sure that you have a wage that's working for Black women, right? But I think that the most important thing is that it can't be a one-day conversation, right? Like it's great to talk about Black women's equal pay day, but my view is every day is Black women's equal pay day, right? Like Black women want to be paid fairly every single day. It can't be a momentary conversation. But I think that as long as we are centering women, Black women in the economic narrative, I feel good about where we're going.
Great, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I always learn so much from you. You are brilliant and thoughtful and incredible, so thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you.
Thank you.